Hey everybody, welcome to Mammoth Interactive's YouTube channel. First of all, I want to thank you for watching this video. And remember that this channel doesn't do Patreon. Instead, we sell our digital courses down below. And every single dollar that we get from the products you buy below goes into making more content. The best way to help out this channel and Mammoth Interactive is to subscribe to Mammoth Interactive's huge library of content. Get thousands of hours and hundreds of courses for a low price down below. We have a monthly option and a yearly option. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the video.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to make a new Vue app instance. Here I have a template set up, just a basic HTML website. You can find this template at the end of the section in the source files. The first step to making a Vue app is to actually import Vue itself into your project. So you can add a script source of https unpackage.com/vue@next. This is the official website where you can get the current version of Vue. Just don't forget to close the script tag. This is going to automatically allow you to use Vue in your project. Alright, let's go ahead and navigate to script.js, where we're going to build a Vue app instance. Whenever you start a Vue app, you open up with a constant app and you use Vue's create app function. You can put in extra information here that you want for creating the app, but this one line, this is the starting point of your Vue app. Following this constant creation, you can then add extra information. That you can take the app and add a component called user input and get the user input component. Components we'll talk about more later on. There are different components of your app, and you can create these components yourself and use them throughout the whole app. You can also add what are known as directives, like a blur directive. And you can also use plugins as well with app.use, and you can use a plugin. This is an overview of how you would structure a Vue app. You can also just chain all of these, like the components, you can chain it with .component, and the directive you can chain it with .directive, and the app.use you chain it with .use. You're chaining all of these to your app here. And this is how you can make a new Vue app instance. Now, if you want to actually render content to your website, to your document object model, then you'd have to add more to your HTML in order to connect the HTML with the Vue. But for starting off with a Vue app, this is the structure you would use. Join me in the next lecture where we're going to continue learning how to set up a Vue app. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to start rendering with Vue, with the Vue root component to be specific. I've opened up our template here, which already has Vue referenced, meaning we can use it. We've got nothing in this template except just a bare bones HTML website. Here in script.js, this is where we add our Vue functionality. We can make a constant such as root component and give it some options in the curly brackets as needed. Then we can make a constant app, and we can use view.createApp to create the root component as the starting point for the rendering. Following this, if we want to use our app and this specific component with a certain div, all we have to do is mount the app instance to that element. Let me show you an example. In index.html, we can make a div and call it with the ID of app and close off the div. This is the HTML reference, and we might have more content in here that we want to connect to Vue. That way Vue can control the content. In order to enable Vue to change this div, what we can do is go to script.js and we can call the app.mount, and we reference the ID of the div that we're mounting to. This is going to get that div with the ID app, and it's going to mount it with the new app, which uses the root component. So any functionality you put into the root component, it will now be accessible by the div, and it can affect the div. It can change the div's contents. This is going to return a root component instance, because this constant root component is kind of like a class, and now we're making an instance of the class. We're making an object. But in Vue, it's called a component and then a component instance. This means that we're now allowing all of the functionality of the root component to affect the app div. And that is how you can start rendering with Vue's root component. Join me in the next lecture, where we're going to continue learning the core concepts of Vue. We're going to learn what are component properties. I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to set properties of components in Vue. That way we can use those properties. Here I've opened up our Vue template. We just have a reference to Vue in our HTML. Let's go ahead and open script.js and add a Vue component with properties. For that, we'll open up a new constant, and we can call this app, and we can use view.createApp. This is going to not only make a new app, but also make a component that allows us to put in data. This is how you would create any component. You would open up a data function, and inside the function you would return some value. This is the basic structure of a component. What we can return is a value such as perhaps value to return, and we can set it something like 100. Now I can access this value to return because it's a property. In order to access that property, first I have to mount my app to some div or some element in my HTML. For that, I'm going to go to index.html, and here I'm going to make a new div. Let's give it the ID of something like app, and let's close off the div. If we mount our Vue app to this div, that means that we can start up the app instance, and it will also be accessible by this div. If we go back to script.js, we can make a constant, and we'll call this app or component instance, doesn't matter. And we use the mount function as per usual to mount our app, which we made, our Vue app, to our div. Oh, and this should be const, not constant. Now that we have mounted the app, we can access the app's properties. In this case, we only have one property known as value to return. How would we access it? Well, we would call the app instance dot value to return. You'll notice here we have to go through the instance to access the property. So we can console.log this to verify that we actually are accessing this value to return property, which is currently 100. And if we pull up our preview and our console, we can see 100 has been printed in the console. If I zoom in, you can see that 100 right there. And if you change the value to return to something else like hello, and you rerun, the cell will now see hello is going to be printed. So this verifies that we were successfully able to access the property known as value to return. We'll be doing this a lot. You'll notice when using Vue, you'll have to access component properties. The app constant is the component, and we are getting the component property value to return. We could then say that we want to put value to return into the div as a paragraph. We could do a lot with this value to return now that we can access it. And that is component properties. Join me in the next lecture where we're going to learn how we can add code at different lifecycle stages. I'll see you in that next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to add code at different lifecycle stages of your Vue app. Alright, for this I've opened up our Vue template. It only has a reference to Vue. Let's open up script.js, where we're going to build a Vue app and then add code at a certain lifecycle stage. For that, we'll use view.createApp, the function that creates a new Vue app. We can define the data function, which is going to define what values we want to return with this create app. We can return, for example, some value such as created. After that, we can add, after the data function, we can add another function, created. This is one type of lifecycle stage. There are many types of lifecycle stages we'll look at more later on in the course. Let's start with a simple one known as created. This means that any code inside this function, it's only going to be run when the Vue app is created. You can set other lifecycle stages as well, and it's going to hold off on running the code until that certain lifecycle stage has been reached. We could set something to happen here at this created stage. We could say console.log, and we could log out the this.sum value. You'll notice here we didn't make an instance of the component. We didn't make a const app. We're just referring to the current instance, the current app instance. This is going to point to our app. And when the app is created, we're going to call console.log and show this.sum value. And this is just one example of how you can run code at a certain lifecycle stage. There are other stages, like for example, you can run code when an app is mounted to an element. That's another option. All right. In the next lecture, we're going to start a brand new section. So join me over there. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mammoth Interactive's Vue 3 course. In this lecture, we are going to build our first Vue.js app together. Here I've opened up a brand new file in REPL.it. I made the file an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file, which you can find by REPL. You just have to select that as the programming language. I've also added a bit of styling to the website just to make it look nicer for all of us as we develop together. You can see I added some very simple styling to the CSS file. I added a font family of sans serif, a color of green for the background or for the text, a color of dark gray for the background, and a padding of 5% around all elements in the body. Now that we've got the default template out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our index.html page. This index.html is the basic page that you will get whenever you start a new HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file in REPL. I've just added a title here, build your first Vue.js app, and a header. By default, REPL will automatically set up the bare bones structure of a website for you. It's going to also include the link to our CSS file and our JavaScript file here in REPL. All right, the first step to building our Vue.js app together is going to be to include Vue in the project. For that, let's go to the head tag, and we're going to include a script source, and this is going to be to https://unpackage.com/vue@next. This is directly from the Vue official website for Vue3.js. This is the link they provide for the most recent version of Vue. In this course, we're using Vue 3, and that is going to be the most recently released version. We also have to close the script tag with a closing script tag. All right, that means we officially have Vue included in our project. Let's go ahead and get started with our first Vue app. We're going to make our first div down here in the body. Let's add it below our title. In this div, we are going to give it an ID. That way we can access the div in Vue. And I'll just hide the preview for now. The ID for the div can be any ID we want, like first Vue app. We could also give it a class if we wanted to, but it's not necessary. Let's close the div, and as such we have our first div. In order to access this div via our JavaScript and via Vue, we have to write the code for accessing whatever we want to put into this div. Let's go to files and script.js. You'll notice right now we have nothing in script.js. So let's put in some code. Let's make a new constant, and I'll just zoom in so you can see this here. We'll make a new constant called your first Vue app. And we'll open an equal sign and curly brackets to create the constant. Next up, we're going to use a function in order to have an action happen with this Vue constant. That function is data, and that's commonly used. We want to use the function data to show that we are creating some data. Then we can use a return function, a return keyword, to specify that we want the your first Vue app constant to return a certain piece of data. For example, it could return a string of text, like this is my first app. Now we can use this text variable in our HTML. Let's go back to our files and HTML, and we're going to go back to that div that we created. Here in this div, which we gave the ID first Vue app, we're going to reference that text that we just made in Vue. To do that, all we have to do is open up double curly brackets and call the variable name like text, because that is the variable we used to return a string via Vue. Now there's one more step we have to take back in our JavaScript. We're going to go back to the JavaScript, and here is that text variable we referenced, but we have to add one more thing, and that is to create the app itself. We have to create an instance of a Vue app. To do that, let's hit enter, and we are going to use the Vue object .createApp. This is a function of the Vue framework createApp. Inside of the parameters of this createApp function, we have to pass in the constant that's going to begin the app. We have to call createApp every time we want to create a Vue app. In our case, we called our constant your first Vue app. After that, we can add .mount in order to mount this constant to a certain HTML item. In our case, we want to mount it to our div, which we gave an ID of, we have to go back to our HTML to remember, first Vue app. We can even copy this to make sure we have no spelling errors. In our JavaScript here, we are going to mount our instance of a new Vue app and the constant. We're going to mount it to our first Vue app div. What we've done here is we've taken the constant and allowed it to be accessible by that div. Otherwise, the div would not be able to access the data inside of the constant. And this is all we need to start our first Vue app. Let's now hit the big run button at the top, and we'll pull up our preview down here in REPL, and we will see, look at that. We now have the text, "This is my first app," being shown in our preview. There it is. That's the whole website right now. Let's take a look at what happened. If we go back to our files and index.html, you'll see we have only 2 pieces of content in our body. We have our header 1, which is build your first Vue app, and we have the div, which contains a reference to a text variable. The only reason we can access this text variable is because we mounted our instance of Vue and a specific constant with this text variable. We mounted it to this div. That's why instead of showing text, we actually see real text. If I go back to JavaScript here, you'll see that is the text that's being shown on the screen. Now, what would happen if I did not mount my Vue instance to this div? Well, let's see what happens if we don't. If we comment out that line and hit run, well, now instead of seeing that message, "This is my first app," now we just see a string that says text. And that's because no longer is this line of code being recognized as a Vue variable. It's now being recognized just as regular text, a regular string. That's why it's important to include this line where we mount the specific div to the instance of Vue. Watch, if I remove the .mount by hitting Command or Control X and I run this line again, look, again we still don't have the message being shown. Even though we created a Vue app, we still have to then mount it to the div that we want to access the constant your first Vue app. Let's hit run again, and this time we'll see the message being shown again. And that was your first Vue.js app. Coming up in the next lecture, we're going to learn more about building websites with Vue. We're going to learn how to render data to the document object model. Let's go ahead and get started in that next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to render content to the DOM by building a timer. For this, I've opened up a new instance of our Vue template. Remember, you can find all the source code at the end of every section in our course. So here I have a new template just with some basic styling and a header. And I'm going to add a new div here, and I'll give it the ID of timer. And let me close off the div as well. And this div is going to contain a timer built with Vue. Let me go to script.js. Currently we have an empty JavaScript file, and let's add a timer. Let me zoom in here so you can see it a bit better. I'll toggle close our preview for now. We're going to define a new constant called timer, and this is going to perform several functions inside of this constant. First, we want to go ahead and build a data function. This is going to contain the data whenever we use the constant timer. The data that we want is to return a timer variable that begins at 0. Following that, let's add a mounted function, which is going to run when we mount the constant. And what we want upon mounting is we'll set an interval, and inside of this set interval we are going to return, let's open up curly brackets here. What we'll do at every interval is we'll call this .timer, which refers to that timer variable, and we'll increment it by 1. After that, let's add the interval to be 1,000. Alright, this is how we can build out the timer. We built the timer with Vue, and now let's go ahead and attach this timer constant to our timer div. I can go back to HTML here and show you, here's our div. It has an ID timer, and we can use this ID to connect the div with the Vue constant. So I'll go back to JavaScript here. I'm going to call view.createApp to generate a new Vue app with timer as my constant to open the app, and I'm going to mount to the timer constant the div with the ID timer. I use a hashtag to show that I'm referring to an ID, and hashtag timer is going to return that div that has the ID timer. Now if I run my code and I pull up my page here, you'll notice we still don't see any extra content. Can you tell me one thing that we are missing that we have to add? One hint is I'll go back to our HTML, and we have to add in one more thing here in our timer div. First, we have to reference our timer class. Notice here. And the timer constant, rather, from Vue. And we use 2 double curly brackets here, and we call the timer variable. What is this timer, you ask? Well, if we go back to JavaScript, it refers to the timer in the data function. Now if we run this file and we run all of them at once, look at that, we now have a timer. It began at 0 and it's incrementing by 1 every second. Here we have it. And that is how you can build a timer with Vue. Coming up, we're going to continue looking at the capabilities of Vue. I hope to see you in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to build reactive behavior with a Vue directive. What we're going to use for this example is when we hover over an element, we're going to see some extra information using reactive behavior. Let's go ahead and open up our Vue template again and start from scratch with that template. And let's begin in index.html. What we want to add into index.html is a new div. We'll give it the ID of toHoverElement, and we'll close off the div immediately. Inside of this div, let's go ahead and add a span item, and we're going to use the vbind keyword and bind a property such as the title. This means that the title can change based on behavior. Our title is going to equal onHoverText, which we'll define shortly. For now, let's close that span tag, and let's give this element some text. We'll say hover over me to see a reactive title. If I run this project now and I pull back up my preview here, right now I can see I have my h1, my header 1, and my text. Right now, when I hover over the text, nothing happens. But let's go ahead and change that using Vue. We're going to jump into our script.js file where we'll build out a new Vue constant. Let's go ahead and make one. We'll call this constant reactive behavior. And we're going to assign the data function, as always. We want it to return some value, and we're going to return an onHover text variable, and we want to put in some message here, such as reactive message. And if I go back to my HTML, I can see that I used onHover text to set my title of the element. That means that this value is going to be returned. Back here in script.js, what do I have to do next? Well, I have to create a new Vue app. I'll use the keyword Vue.createApp. I am creating reactive behavior, which is that constant, and mounting it to an element. What is the element we're mounting to? Well, let's go back to index.html, and the element we're binding to has the ID toHoverElement. That is the ID we're going to use. So we can copy this, and back here, back in script.js, as a string we pass in the ID, but we just also have to make sure we include a %sign to show that toHoverElement refers to an ID. Now if I run all of the files and pull back up my preview, let's see what happens when I hover over my text. And look at this. Now when I hover over me, after 2 seconds, we now see reactive message as the title. And that is that title that appears via Vue. Whenever you hover over an element, you can access its title just like that. And we can see our title because we used Vue. Coming up, we're going to learn more about Vue. We're going to learn how to enable user interaction, even just beyond reacting to a user. Join me in the next lecture to learn about that. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to enable user interaction with Vue.js. Here I have our Vue template opened up again, and I'm going to add a new div here. We're going to show user interaction by using the example of a button. We're going to build a button, and when the user clicks on the button, it's going to change some content on the page. Let's start by building a div. We'll give it an ID of text to reverse, because that's right, you guessed it, we're going to be reversing text with our button. And let's close off the div. Following this, we can go ahead and we'll open up a new paragraph. This paragraph is going to contain a text variable, which is that text we want to reverse. And we're also going to implement a button. The button is going to use viewOn, which is a keyword for performing some action upon an event. The event is going to be click. So we're using viewOn, which is Vue's on keyword. And whenever we click the button, we're going to perform some action. The action is going to be check palindrome. Let's close off the button and give the button some text, such as check if palindrome. If I run this code cell and all the files now, currently I have just the text as well as a button, and when I click on the button, nothing happens. But let's go ahead and now implement the text variable in Vue, so that way this container, this placeholder, is going to change to an actual value, and the button will perform an action. We'll do that in script.js. Let's go ahead and open our blank JavaScript file, and here's where we're going to make a new Vue app. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'll make a constant called user interaction. It's going to have a data function as per usual, and the data that we want to return with this constant is text. We can return some text like, for example, race cars. This text variable is directly going to replace what we currently have as the double curly brackets and text. That's all going to be replaced instead with the value race cars, thanks to Vue. So I can go back here, and what I want to do is build out my function. If I go back to index.html, you'll see not only did I build that paragraph text, but I also specified that on the click of the button, I want to perform some function check palindrome. So let me go ahead and implement that next, this check palindrome. Alright, so we'll do that back in our script.js. We're going to add a methods keyword, which means we're specifying a method. The method is check palindrome, and I'm going to open up a new function, and this is going to contain check palindrome. Now let's see, we want to also ensure that it matches the same name here, the same casing as well. If you're using camel casing here, you want to use camel casing in Vue as well, so these have to match exactly. Back in script.js, we can fill out this function. Whenever this function is called, let's go ahead and set this.text to equal this.text, but also we want to split it at every space. Then we want to reverse it, and finally we want to join it back. This means we're going to split not even at every space, but just at every character, because we have here an empty string. Alright, that's how we can reverse a piece of text. And that is going to check whether the text is a palindrome, because a palindrome can be read the same forwards and backwards. So if we reverse a piece of text and it's the same, that means it's a palindrome. One more step we have to take is to use Vue to create the app. We need to pass in user interaction as the constant to be used, and we'll mount to it our text to reverse. Text to reverse is the div we have here with the ID text to reverse, and that is going to mount the div to the Vue app. Now if we run all these files and we pull up our preview, first change we notice is that our text has changed to race cars. So we actually are showing a piece of text from Vue instead of the piece of text from HTML. The second change we notice is if I click the button, well, my text suddenly changes. It reverses every time I click on the button. You can see that it reverses the whole string. Race car is a palindrome, but race cars is not a palindrome, and we can see that when we click the button. And that is how you can enable user interaction with Vue. Coming up, we're going to continue our look at Vue. We're going to learn how we can get user input. Join me in the next lecture to continue learning. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how you can enable user input with Vue. Let's go ahead and open up our Vue template, and we're going to add a new div to our website here. The div is going to have the ID of input form, and let's close that div immediately. This div is going to contain the whole form where the user can put in information. For the form, we'll first need a paragraph. We're going to use double curly brackets to show that we're referencing a Vue variable. The Vue variable can be called input text. And don't forget to close the paragraph tag. Following this, let's go ahead and build out an input element. And we're going to use the keyword viewmodel. We're going to add a model known as input text from Vue. An input element in HTML, it's self-closing, so you close it with the same tag that you opened it with. Alright, if we run this file now and pull up our preview, currently you can see we have input text and we have an input field where I can type in random content. We're going to replace the input text with an actual value, whatever the user types into the input. If a user types in hello into the form, we're going to show hello. Let's go ahead and open up script.js in order to build out that functionality. Here in script.js, we're going to build a new constant. Let me zoom in here, and we'll call the constant user input. We're going to assign it equal to some data function that will return a value. The value, we already called it input text, and we can put in any value that we want here to start, such as type here. Whatever the user enters into the input field is going to be shown in place of input text. And how did we achieve that? Well, because we used what is known as the viewmodel. Alright, let's see. Now back in script.js, let's go ahead and create a new Vue app. We're going to use view.createApp, and we'll use our user input constant. We're going to mount to the Vue app the div input form. If we go back to HTML, we can see input form is the div that contains the paragraph and the input. Now I can run all my files and pull up the preview here. You'll see by default I have type here, and type here appears not just in my paragraph but also in my input field by default. If I clear my input field, well, look at that, it also cleared my paragraph. But let's say I type in something here into my input field, it also immediately appears in my paragraph. And that is how you can enable user input with Vue. Coming up, we're going to continue learning about Vue. We're going to learn how to create conditional visibility, which means we're getting into conditionals. Join me in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use conditionals. For example, how to hide or show an element based on a conditional. Here I have our Vue template open, and let's go ahead and add in a new div. And this is the div that we're going to hide or show content inside depending on a conditional. For that, let me toggle close my preview for now, and I'll zoom in. And I'll make a new div with an ID such as conditional visibility. And I will close the div. Inside of the div, I'm going to use a span tag, and I'm going to use vif, which is Vue's if statement. And I'll say if visible is equal to true. Then I'm going to show some content such as visible content. And don't forget to close the span tag. Now in my script.js, I can write the view app and the view constant that's going to display this text, visible content, only if visible is true. So let's go to script.js, and here we're going to make a new constant. We'll call this Conditional Visibility, and we're going to close it off. For its data function, we're going to return that variable visible, and we'll set it to true initially, the Boolean true. This directly refers to that visible variable we're using here for our conditional v-if. So if the visible variable is true, only then will we show the content. And we set the conditional here. If we set this to false, we won't show the text. If we set it to true, we will show the text. Vue is going to control the visibility. The last step we have to perform is to call view.createApp, and we're creating the app with the constant conditional visibility. And we also need to mount the ID of the div that we are using for this constant, and that is, if we go back to index.html, the div we're using to mount the app is conditional visibility. So we can copy that ID, and in script.js we can add it to that line. Alright, so now when I hit run, we are going to see visible content. The reason we see visible content is because in index.html we use the v-if statement, and we're only going to show the content inside of the span tag if visible is true. Now you may be thinking, what if I set visible to false? Well, what do you think is going to happen if I set my visible variable in Vue in script.js to false? Well, now when I hit run, look at that. I no longer see that text because I set visible to false, and this is the exact variable that's going to control whether we show the text in the span tag. And that is how you can hide or show with conditionals. Coming up next, we are going to continue learning about Vue. We are going to learn how to build out a list. Join me in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to build a list with Vue. Here I have our template open up, and I'm going to get started in index.html. I'm going to add a new div that will be the container for the list that we'll build. So let's go ahead and build out the list. We'll make a div and we'll give it an ID list. And let's go ahead and close the div immediately. What type of list do we want to make this? Well, we could do ordered with OL, or we could do unordered with UL. Whatever you do, make sure you close off the list as well. After this, we are going to make a list element, and we're going to use the v-for statement, which is Vue's for, like a for loop. And what we'll do is for each item in list items, which is controlled by Vue, we're going to perform some action. This v-for, that's a for loop, and we're going to loop through our variable each item in list items, which we'll make shortly in Vue. Let's close off the list tag, and inside of the list tag we want to use Vue to show each item dot item. So we want to show each item in our list and show its contents. Now that we have the HTML set up, Let's go into script.js where we're actually going to build out the list. Here we have an empty JavaScript file, and let's make a constant called list, a view constant. And for the data, we are going to return our list. Now, what did we call the list? Well, we go back to index.html and we called the list items. So we're going to use that same variable name and we're going to make an array. The array is going to have a list of items. We can call this item. In fact, we have to call this item because if we go back to index.html, you can see each item here, that is just a local variable local to this div. List items, that actually comes from Vue. That's a variable from Vue. And the item property of each item is referring to the item property inside of list items. Here we can have an item such as study Vue course, and that is one item in the list. You can add a comma and a curly bracket to open up another item. And this can be something like learn React Native. Then we could have another item that says study Angular. So here we have 3 different items in our list items. And this is all an array. And if we go back to index.html, you can see for each item in list items, we're getting its item property. So each item is referring to each of these curly bracket rows in our array. And for each of those rows, we're getting the item property value, which is study Vue course, learn React Native, study Angular. Our last step is going to be to mount the Vue app to this list constant and to our list div. So that's what we'll add. We'll add view.createApp. We want to create app with the constant list. And we also want to mount the ID of the div we made. If we go back to index.html, we can see we want to mount it to this div with the ID list. So we can go back to script.js and use list as our ID of the element we're mounting the constant to. Now I can run my files and pull up my preview, and look at that. I now have a list created for me by Vue. It says study Vue course, learn React Native, study Angular. And that is how you can build a list with Vue. In this lecture, you learned how to build a list and how to use Vue's for loop in order to loop through the list. Join me in the next lecture where we're going to start a brand new section. I'll see you over there. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Vue course. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to interpolate text and HTML from Vue to HTML. For this, I've opened up our template again, and let's get started in script.js. Here we're going to write a new Vue app. We'll open up a constant and we'll call this, let's say, Interpolate app. And we're going to define the data of the app of this component. It's going to return some HTML. We can call this, for example, HTML. And in this HTML, we can set some text that we want to show, like, for example, text in blue. We can wrap this text in a span tag and give it a style of color blue. Now just make sure you use single quotes if you started with double quotes. So what we're doing here is we're just showing how you can manipulate HTML. via Vue. Let's close off the span tag. Currently, this HTML, it's in Vue, but we need to get it to our HTML, index.html. In order to do that, we're going to have to mount this component to some element in our index.html. So here in index.html, let's go ahead and we're going to make a new div. We'll give it the ID of app, and let's close the div. Then back in script.js, we can call view.createApp to create the app with the Interpolate app component, and we're going to mount it to the app div. And now we can access this HTML value, we can access this property and all of its contents, its value, in index.html. There are several ways that we could access that property. One way is to use handlebars, which are double curly brackets, and we have to call our HTML value. Now we can access this because we mounted the div app, we mounted it to this component, which is why we can access the component property. So now if I run this file and I pull up my preview, I just have to refresh my REPL here, so that way the URL refreshes. And then once it connects, I can run the files, and it's going to show me currently span style color blue text in blue /span. So that's because in script.js we were able to get the value of this HTML property. But if we want to actually convert this from a string to HTML, we can't just use handlebars. Handlebars is for accessing a value, but to access HTML, to translate a value into HTML, we have to use something else. What we're going to do instead is to open up a new span tag and use vHTML. This is Vue's HTML property, and we're going to pass in HTML as whatever string we want to be treated as HTML instead of just a regular text. Don't forget to close the span tag as well. So handlebars is used very often, but if you want to specifically render HTML, then use vHTML instead. Now when I run this, look at that. Text in blue is what I'm seeing now being rendered. And that's because now my value of the HTML property, it's being read not as a string, but actually it's being compiled as HTML. And that is how you can interpolate text with handlebars and HTML with the vHTML keyword. Alright, join me in the next lecture where we're going to continue learning about Vue. We're going to learn how to handle data properties.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this course. If you want to watch the rest of the course, the link is down below. Not only will you get the access to this course, but you'll get access to a lot of other courses in a huge bundle, and it's on sale today. So buy before the sale ends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.